Hello, everyone, and welcome to DRJ's webinar series. I'm Bob Arnold, President here at DRJ. Today's sponsor is Sungard Availability Services, and the topic is Resiliency in the Face of the 21st Century Disaster. Before we get started, I wanted to review a couple housekeeping items, as well as wishing our colleagues in the Florida Panhandle best of luck right now, as Hurricane Michael is just now hitting the coast. But in regards to the webinar, today's session is being recorded. This recording will be shared with everyone a few days after the webinar is ended. Attendees are also in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question, please use the question function located on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll answer as many of these questions as possible at the end of the session. Now I'd like to introduce you to Joseph George. Joseph is the Vice President of Product Management at Sungard AS. He is responsible for product management for the Recovery as a Service portfolio, as well as managed hosting. He is a highly experienced technology product management leader, strong understanding of technology, extensive business management experience, and proven analytical skills. Joseph is also a frequent author of technical articles and blogs for CIO and Forbes. And with no further delay, I'd like to welcome and turn the mic over to Joseph.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Bob. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you out in the West Coast. Great to see the attendance and the interest in this topic. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to explore and understand how to stay resilient in the 21st century, especially in the face of a disaster. So I wanted to start out first with some images of what a disaster looks like. And as you can see here, this is a picture of a flooded street. That view was literally close to home for me. That is in fact a photo that I took just outside the front of my house on the afternoon of August 27, 2017, in a suburb of Houston where we live. And this is just after Tropical Storm Harvey had hit. For 4 days straight,
Joseph,
we were trapped at home.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Joseph. It looks like you're not sharing screens here real quick. Can you maybe try exit practice mode or exit the presentation mode? There you go, and then get back in. There you go, perfect.
Okay, that seems to work. Sorry about that. So essentially what I was saying was that for 4 days straight, we were trapped in the house. The water was rising. There was no sign of the rains abating, and Harvey had hit the city pretty hard. In fact, some parts of the city had received almost 50 inches of rain over a 4-day period. And that is a record for a major U.S. city. To put that into context, if you think about Houston, one of the wettest cities in the United States, we receive about 51 inches of rain a year, and that's what we got in 4 days' time. And the loss of life and estimated damages were pretty significant, over $125 billion, with some estimates closer to $180 billion. My family was fortunate that the floods did not affect us. It did not enter our home. And as we looked out, we saw that there was no sign of the rain stopping. We could have evacuated before the storm hit, but I felt we were safe. Our neighborhood had retention ponds. And the mentality that I had was, this affects other parts of Houston, right? I'm safe. My area is not going to be impacted. What's interesting is that a few days later, when I saw the sight of an empty grocery store shelf, that was a welcome sight, because what that meant was that I was finally able to get out of the house and drive. There's another view here. You see the view of basically an office building. That, in fact, is our Sungard AS office in Houston. The area in West Houston was pretty badly impacted, and we were out of our office for several weeks. Now, what is interesting was, during the time I was looking at the National Hurricane Center NOAA map, and it showed 3 named storms at the same time in the Atlantic, a phenomenon that had not been seen for years. So this is kind of interesting, right? Regardless of which side you take in the global warming debate, I think it's hard to argue that every year the frequency, the impact of these natural disasters, like hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, they seem to be getting just worse. And as Bob alluded to, even as we speak, Hurricane Michael is impacting the Florida Panhandle just a few weeks after Florence hit the Carolinas. So the question I have for you, ladies and gentlemen, is this the face of the 21st century? Is this what we have to deal with? Now, as significant as these natural events are, there's really a different type of unique 21st century disaster that I'm referring to. I'm really talking about the outages caused by cyber attacks and ransomware. So what I've got here is some well-publicized outages. These are excerpts from newspaper reports. And what I want you to do is, as you look at the description here, think about the description. And I want you to guess, is that the result of a natural disaster or is that the result of a cyber disaster? The first one here talks about a hospital. They had to divert 900 patients to other hospitals and they had to revert to manual systems. So think about that from a business perspective, that's probably the worst thing you want to do, right? You're sending your customers to your competitors. In the case of a hospital, you want to make sure people are taken care of. Question for you, does this feel like a natural disaster that caused this outage, or is it a cyber disaster? Think about that for. Well, here's the keyword that gives this away, right? If you read further, it says that no personal data was compromised. And this example was essentially a ransomware attack that impacted Hollywood Presbyterian. The LA Times actually reports that the hospital chose to pay the ransom in order to recover from that situation. Here's a second outage, right? So in this case, it talks about IT systems being focused on the recovery of critical systems. They're focused on restoring the most critical ones first, and then the remaining operational systems. And it says we can't estimate how long it's going to take to restore those systems that are impacted. Right? Those of you in the IT space, this is probably one of your worst nightmares, right? You're thinking about this. There's an outage. You're trying to get things back under control. Is this a natural disaster or is it a cyber disaster? The reality is, just from the description, it's pretty hard to tell, right? This actually, if you read further, the press article continues and says that this company was not sure that they could restore all their systems or even recover all their critical business data. And this is actually a very well publicized cyber attack on the FedEx TNT unit. This was the NotPetya ransomware attack, and it impacted shipments. And what's interesting is FedEx actually reported a financial loss of $300 million as a result of this attack. So this really impacted their business, both in terms of perception as well as financially. Here's a third example, right? Here someone says they're looking at a directory that had a bunch of files, and those files are starting to disappear, right? And they're basically panicking and saying, unplug the machine, because they're seeing files disappear from in front of their eyes. So is this a natural disaster or a cyber disaster? What's causing these files to be deleted? Well, this one is an interesting one, right? It's not really a cyber attack. This happened at Pixar IT, and this was where a large chunk of the Toy Story 2 data was deleted inadvertently by a mistake that an IT employee had made, right, executing the wrong command. And the problem was that their backups had not been working for a while, and they hadn't noticed it. But it illustrates the point that even though this was a mistake by an employee, think about the damage that a ransomware attack or a cyber attack can do in terms of deleting data and bringing your business down. Are you recoverable in those situations? The last one here, employees are told to call a number, right, for snow emergencies. This reads pretty much like a classic IT disaster, right? And basically saying, they're not even sure if they can report back to work the next day. This, again, was a ransomware attack, and basically was Merck, pharmaceutical company. Their estimates were that the damage was to the tune of $135 million, and they had a resulting production shutdown. I remember presenting this and talking to at a conference, and one of the customers there, he talked about how, as a pharmaceutical company, once this attack happened, they spent the next several months actually focusing on that. And it illustrated to me the point that we often don't think about these types of events until it hits close to home. When it either impacts us directly, or somebody close to us, or the industry we're in, that's when we tend to pick up and take notice. The reality is, if you look at the descriptions of all these outages, it's all about system downtime, data loss. And it doesn't matter if it was triggered by a cyber attack or a natural disaster. The outcome is just as significant, and the economic costs are pretty significant as well. So the question is, how do you prepare yourself, and how real is this risk? The World Economic Forum publishes an annual global risks report. So here, they actually outline the top risks that we as an economy face. And these are not IT-related risks, right? So if you look at the list here, there's a number of them, things like, energy price shock and unemployment and those types of things. And what struck me was in the 2018 report, cyber attacks were ranked number 8. Number 8, not just in terms of IT risks, but in terms of all potential risks that you as a company can face. That's pretty amazing when you think about that. And that's well ahead of extreme weather events and natural catastrophes, which still made the top 20 list, but in 18th and 19th place there. So that's a change. That's a change that's happened, right? And that's what we have to think about in terms of a 21st century disaster. These cyber attacks and these ransomware attacks, these are real, right? And we've seen through the examples here, these are real examples. There's a lot more that we can look at. And it's important for us to understand, how do we prepare, how do we prevent, and how do we recover when we have these attacks? So there's this notion of cyber resilience, right? When you think about resilience, it's all about how do you maintain operations in the face of a disaster, in the face of an event. So this is really talking about a cyber event. How do you make sure that you minimize your data loss and your downtime resulting from the cyber or ransomware attack? And the key thing there is it involves bringing multiple parts of the organization together. This is where the problem has changed. From the way we think about disaster recovery traditionally in the 20th century, now we need to think about this as almost a three-pronged approach. The cyber resilience no longer means just recovery or just security. It's how these things all come together. And how do we make sure we have a coordinated approach? There are 3 elements, if you will, in achieving cyber resiliency. The first is around business readiness. So when you think about this, this is really about the people, the process, the governance. In many ways, these are the non-technology aspects. How do you, as an organization, respond to these types of threats and outages? And in many ways, it's also cultural, right? What's interesting is these things don't happen by chance, right? You're not ready for these disasters just because you have a bunch of smart people, but it's because you've been trained and you're ready and you've got the right systems in place. And that's what I want to talk about through the rest of this webinar. From a security standpoint, a lot of the focus is about preparing and making sure you can detect and ideally prevent those security incidents and attacks, right? That's the best possible scenario. And as an industry, we've spent a lot of money in this space, right? You've got security teams focused on plugging the holes, preventing these attacks. The reality is, it's not about if you are going to be attacked, it's about when you're going to be attacked. And the key thing is making sure you're ready. When that happens, do you fundamentally have a clean copy of your data? Do you have a plan in place? Do you have an isolated environment where you can recover your business and be back in business? When you talk about the cyber threat landscape, we know that it's continually changing. And there's a variety of threats, right? As you can see here, there's both external and internal threats. And there's a wide scope of these types of threats that you face. The external threats, you have the usual culprits, right? The denial of service attacks, DDoS attacks, phishing, hackers, people who are trying to get to your systems and trying to get to your data. But you also have to make sure that you're thinking about insider threats, right? And internal threats. You've got employees, contractors, rogue employees, anybody from inside that can potentially corrupt your systems or steal data. That's the other part of it that you need to consider as well. And typically customers and companies are focused on the security aspect, right? A lot of the focus has been on how do I make sure I have a strong detection and prevention strategy? In fact, most estimates are that the cybersecurity market is continuing to grow significant rates, upwards of $100 billion, and it's amazing to see the number of security startups that come up every year, right? This is a space that's continuing to grow and evolve. The reality is you need to couple your security solutions and security capabilities with a strong remediation capability as well, right? The balance between prevention and detection, as well as remediation and recovering from those outages, is what's important. And that's what I want to talk about as well. As we talk about cyber attacks, one of the most publicized attacks was the Wannacry ransom attack back in May of 2017, and it impacted more than 200,000 computers worldwide. Now, what's interesting is that Microsoft had actually released a patch a couple of months in advance, right, that identified a vulnerability that could be exploited by ransomware. But as we all know, right, patching is not something that's always followed, right, by all organizations, especially smaller companies were particularly vulnerable to this type of attack. You can see here, this is sort of the heat map of the impact of Wannacry, and the thing that stands out is that Europe got hit a lot more worse than North America, and we were better at protecting our systems and not being impacted as much as our European counterparts. In the case of Wannacry, these attackers, they encrypted the contents of your hard drive, your data, and the only way you could get access to it was if you paid a ransom or you're able to recover separately from a different environment. This malware was designed to spread through the network, gaining unauthorized access to shares in the network. And you end up in a situation where organizations have a challenge, right? When you're hit by this ransomware attack, the question is to pay or not to pay, right? If you think about it, right, the risk is that even if you do pay the ransom, there is no guarantee that you're going to get access to your data and that you're going to be able to restore your business, because you're actually giving access, right? You're putting your trust in the bad guys, right? The guys who are actually trying to hack your system and extort money from you. What is the guarantee that they're going to actually give you the key that helps you decode and decrypt your data? In fact, it could be worse. You can be introducing additional issues into your system by giving them access and allowing them to try and fix something that they caused in the first place. Although Wannacry is typically highlighted, this is only one type of attack, right? So ransomware is just one type of attack, and there are many types of security attacks and cyber events that we have to be aware of. So as I walk through at a high level, right, there's fundamentally three types or three categories of attacks. But the first are the ones that compromise your network. And an example is the distributed denial of service sort of attack, right? Basically, your defense approach there is more around preventing it. Then you've got the types of attacks that gain access to data. We've heard of well-publicized data breaches. There again, you want to make sure you can prevent the attack and plan also for remediation if you are impacted. And the third category is those types of attacks that disrupt your business operations, right? So it's not just about access to data, but they're potentially corrupting your data, deleting your data in the worst case, right? And that's the threat of these ransomware attacks. So you want to be able to prevent these attacks, but you also have to plan for isolated remediation and to be able to bring your business back up. So I'm going to cover this at a high level. Clearly, there are security experts at Sungard AS as part of our security services team. They can do a much better job of talking about it from a security angle. But I want to make sure we can talk about each of these at a high level so we understand, here's the gamut of possible attacks. Here's what we have to deal with in terms of making sure that we're resilient as businesses. When you think about these DDoS types of attacks, right, it's all about how do you protect yourself, right? And how do you make sure that from a perimeter standpoint, you're protected, right? And then the challenge is that you have these zero-day attacks, right? So basically where you've got a previously unknown security vulnerability, so you don't have patches yet. It's not about not following up with your security policies. It's about vulnerabilities that have been exploited by ransomware, and now you're impacted, right? And essentially what's happening is that these DDoS attacks are basically impacting your systems, and you're not able to execute any transactions. There's multiple variants of these types of attacks. You can try to prevent them, but when you're hit, then really what you've got to do is make sure you've got a system in place to redirect all that malicious traffic to a third party that can absorb it and send clean traffic back to your business. Again, over years, we've gotten a lot better at preventing and dealing with these types of attacks, and then figuring out these malicious IP addresses and being able to blacklist them. From a data breach perspective, we've heard of a number of these, right? Equifax was one of the most publicized data breaches there. And this is where you've got the hackers gaining access to your systems, right? And they're identifying vulnerabilities, they're getting access to data that you have. One example is SQL injection. So this is where there's malicious input in the actual query, and that tricks a database system into actually revealing data that you have to keep proprietary. And the key here, as you can see on the right side, from a security perspective, we hear about this notion of defense in depth, a variety of approaches. It's not a one-size-fits-all, right? All the way from perimeter protection, patching, network segmentation, file integrity monitoring, all those types of things. You want to put all those things in place, and your defense is in depth to try and prevent it from happening. But again, we still hear about a lot of these outages and these impacts, right, from data breaches. And the key thing there is making sure that you've got an incident response time plan when it happens. You're making sure that you patch any vulnerabilities as quickly as possible. And the other thing to think about in these sort of situations is they can become very public. So how do you make sure that you're thinking about your crisis communications as well, making sure you've got the right stakeholders in handling these types of situations as well? Last but not least is the ransomware type of attack, right? So this is again where you've got the hackers that basically infiltrate your systems and they're encrypting your data, making it essentially unusable, right? At this point, your systems are down, your business is not able to operate. And as a result, you've got a couple of choices, right? You can pay and hope that you get access to be able to decrypt your data and return to normal operations, or you can try to recover. Now, the biggest difference is in the defense tactic here is that you have to make sure that if you're taking a recovery plan, that you've got an isolated environment, right? And you can use that isolated environment for remediation and for recovering your business. So I've talked about, here's the 21st century disaster, right? We've talked about cyber attacks, ransomware, how these are prevalent. We've talked about the different types of cyber incidents and the variety of them. And what's interesting is, if you look at what's happening in the industry out there and how are people responding to this, there's a survey that Sungard AS administered. It was actually administered by Qualtrics on behalf of us. And they queried a variety of IT business leaders, about 500 plus, and asked them the question, right? Because of all these well-publicized cybersecurity incidents, are you modifying or are you reconsidering modifying your existing recovery plans? Companies have had DR plans in place for years. They haven't thought about these types of things. Are they changing it as a result? And the answers are kind of encouraging here, right? If you look at this, almost 80% of the respondents said that they would reconsider their existing recovery plans and take into account this 21st century disaster, or they would implement a brand new recovery plan. I think about the remaining 20%, they're either well ahead of everyone else and are well prepared already, or they are in trouble, right, when the next time they're impacted by a cyber attack. So think about that yourselves, right? Where are you with your recovery plans? Have you thought about those? Have you modified those? Are you prepared? Are you ready for these types of cybersecurity incidents? I thought this one is even more interesting, right? This was a second question, which is basically about how much value in cryptocurrency has your organization purchased as a precaution against ransomware attacks? And I have to admit, I was surprised by the answer, right? So out of the 500 or so respondents, more than half actually said yes, that they had protected themselves by buying some cryptocurrency. And what's surprising is you look at the number that's above 500,000, right? So almost 25%, a quarter of the 268 respondents actually had purchased more than $500,000 in Bitcoin. Now this was, late 2017 when the survey was done. So at that time, Bitcoin was way up there, right? So it might have been an investment strategy, right? Potentially, but clearly that probably hasn't paid off for them. But the key thing here is companies are taking this seriously, right? If you're not, remember that your peers are, right? This is something that's serious. The World Economic Forum ranks at number 8. You've got companies out there actually investing in cryptocurrency to try and be prepared if they have to pay a ransom. And then, taking that risk of knowing that even if you pay, there's no guarantee that your systems can be brought back up. So the key thing here is, how do you ensure resiliency? What I've got up here is the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? Like I said, the focus of this presentation is on the respond and recover pieces. Obviously, a lot of the focus needs to be in your security investments, identifying threats, protecting against it, making sure you've got the right protection in place, both in your host systems as well as your network and your perimeter. It's being able to detect these issues, detect these attacks, and be able to respond very quickly. But as you're impacted, right, if you have an outage, how do you respond? How do you recover, right? That's where I want to spend some time here. And especially from a disaster recovery perspective, how does that change your approach to this 21st century disaster? And what's interesting is, if you think about the teams involved, right, security teams have a very different view from the disaster recovery team, right? A security team typically is looking at trying to identify what caused this issue, right? If I have an actual incident, how do I make sure I understand which systems are impacted? How do I quarantine the malware if it's already on my systems, right? Where did it originate? What sort of threats are involved? Are we protecting against future attacks? In some cases, there might be compliance requirements. Who do I need to notify as a result of this, right? Those are the types of questions the security teams handle. If you think about disaster recovery teams, the focus is a little bit different, right? The disaster recovery team, they're driven by this notion of RTOs and RPOs, right? RTO is basically how much business time, how much data loss can you, how much downtime can you afford? And your RPO is how much data loss can you afford, right? And they're thinking about the business functions that are impacted. What's the quickest ways to get these systems back up and running? The focus there is, how do I respond as quickly as possible, bring my system back up so it can be operational as a business and reduce the impact. So in fact, some of those preferences, some of how the teams think may be in conflict, right? Where a security team is looking at how do we preserve the system data for forensics. The disaster recovery team is looking at how do I recover and bring my system back up as quickly as possible. So the key thing here to realize is, in order to respond to this 21st century disaster, these teams need to work together. So I think that's a key takeaway for you all. If you're not doing this already, and you've got security teams that are completely disparate from the disaster recovery teams, and they're not working together on identifying and handling these disasters, then that's the call to action. And it's important to have a joint approach to addressing this. If your recovery and security teams are talking to each other for the first time in the event of a disaster, right? If it's a reactive response, you've got an outage, now I've got to bring these teams together and respond to it, it's too late, right? You want to make sure that the teams are working together ahead of time. It's very clear who has what role, what are the decisions, at what point you decide to declare and fail over to another environment rather than trying to recover in place. Those are the types of decisions that now need to involve both these teams. So this approach also goes beyond just technology. It's also people, it's the process, it's the governance. How do you bring all these things together in place so you can effectively respond to this 21st century disaster? If you think about how you recover, right? Sungard AS, we've obviously been in the space for many years and have continued to be a leader in terms of IT disaster recovery and recovery as a service. And the thing that we've seen is, regardless of how you manage your disaster recovery, right? Whether you're doing this in-house, you've got dual data centers and you're doing it as a capability within your IT environment, whether you're doing this with a third-party service provider, whether you're doing this in a third-party co-location facility, but you've got your people to do it, there's fundamentally three elements to successful recovery, three building blocks, if you will. The first is you've got to make sure you protect your data. If your data is not protected, and if you don't have a clean copy of your data in an offsite location, then in that event of that disaster, you're in trouble. Right? So a lot of companies think about, they think we've got an HA system in place, we've got clustering in place, and you're dealing with certain types of threats. But what happens if your data center is impacted, right? And then what do? Do you have your data at an offsite location? And as I described the experience that I went through where we were surrounded by floodwaters, one of my thoughts at the time was, is my data protected, right? Even if I lose my computers, even if I lose all my systems here, if my data is protected, it's going to be painful to get back up and running. But then I have my data somewhere else and it is possible for me to recover, right? The second element that is just having your data, that's not sufficient, right? That's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece is you've got to have an environment to be able to connect to. You've got to have those servers, the compute, the network, the storage. You've got to be able to build your IT environment with that data and recover your systems. And so that's the second element that you've got to have. And the third element is determining who does what. Who's going to manage that recovery, right? Who's defining all the procedures? Who's defining and maintaining that? Because part of the biggest challenges is that when production systems change, you have to keep your disaster recovery in sync with those production system changes. So is that something that you're managing completely internally? Is it something that you're partnering with third-party organizations? Are those roles defined? Because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is that outcome of making sure your business application is up and running and your stakeholders are operational. Now, what's happened over the years is technologies have evolved. So we've got much faster ways of doing these things, right? We've got data replication, automated, orchestrated recovery technologies and services in place. And you're able to recover your business much quicker than you would have been able to 10 or 15 years ago. But there's always the cost risk element that you have to look at, right? If these are critical systems, that's much more important for you to recover. And if they're tier 2, tier 3 types of systems, you may not want to invest the same level of disaster recovery investments. So that's an important piece to think about. Now, what's happened in the DR space is that over the years, we've seen the evolution, and the move has always been to improving and more aggressive RTOs, right? More aggressive RPOs. It's all about making sure that you've got the most recent copy of data and that you're able to recover from that. That works perfectly well in the case of a natural disaster, right? If you have a hurricane, you have the most recent copy of your data available offsite, excellent, you can go and recover from that. But the problem is with these ransomware attacks, in some cases, you don't know about them for up to 2 or 3 months. So you might have been infected, the ransomware was dormant in your system, and at that point, how do you recover your systems? So again, this is where the complexity comes in, right? The recovery from that cyber attack can vary, depends on the type of ransomware attack. In some cases, you can start with a clean system and fix things, patch your systems and get going. In other cases, you have to recover to a point before the ransomware was triggered. And in others, you may even have to go back to the point before you were infected in the first place. So it just depends on the type of ransomware, and you need to have the flexibility of approaches. The key thing here is the ability to go back to an older copy of your data, because that may be the only way that you can bring your business back up and running. So what that means is that the philosophy around recovery is changing to some extent, right? Where the focus was on maintaining physical or geographic separation and making sure you had your most recent snapshot of data, what's happening now is it's also about logical separation of your systems. How do you make sure that you've got snapshots of your data, you've got backups of your data, so you can go back to older copies if that's the only way that you can recover your system. And the key thing here is making sure that you've got access to a clean environment, an isolated environment, where you can actually bring your systems back up with the confidence that the malware is not propagated there. The key point here is you may have an active environment, plan A. You might have the latest disaster recovery as a service capability, plan B. But you also need to make sure you think about your plan C, right? What happens if you've got a ransomware attack and you need to go back to those older copies of data? What's key here is, from a disaster recovery standpoint, what you have to do at a high level is pretty much the same, right? It's all about recovering your systems from a copy of the data. What's different is the triggers. The triggers are now different, and how you do it are different, as I just described. And the approach that you need to take in terms of your plans for disaster recovery and how you respond are also going to be different. The other piece to think about as well is, with a classic natural disaster, right, there's almost a very specific approach to how you recover. You might have a run book that you can almost follow to the T, right? You might have to make some exceptions, but for the most part, the run book is fairly well defined. You can execute those steps. It's pretty predictable, and you know what to do, right? It's very, very predictable and deterministic. When you're dealing with cyber attacks, in many cases, there's different variants, right? So you've got to be agile, and you've got to be able to respond, even at time of recovery, to be able to make sure that you've got a certain set of run books, so you've got the plans in place, but also the flexibility to respond depending on the type of variant that you've been impacted by. So it also changes the culture, it changes the way organizations think about disaster recovery, as opposed to, here's just a set of run books that I define, I can just blindly execute. I now need to think about this and think about different variants, have an organization that's agile and able to adjust and adapt to the situation that you're impacted by. Now, as you think about this, I sort of alluded to this earlier, the key challenge obviously is cost, right? If cost was not an objective, we'd all be driving Ferraris, and we'd have our tier 0 systems protected just like our tier 4 systems. But at the end of the day, you've got to pick and choose, right? You've got to decide which systems do you want to make sure that you've got the best protection in place. You're protected both in the event of a natural disaster as well as a cyber attack, and where you can afford very minimal downtime or data loss. And you're dealing with essentially replication of systems, replication of data, you're dealing with automated recovery systems, and you're also dealing with backups in place so you can recover in the case of ransomware. Now, the other piece that you're seeing as well is, with replication systems, you're seeing services where you can keep more snapshots of the data, so more than the classic 3 or 4 days. But again, there's a cost piece of that as well, right? The more snapshots you keep, there's a cost element to that as well. That's what you've got to weigh and determine the trade-off there. The key point that I want to make here is, as you think about resilience in your business, you've got to make sure you understand your application criticality tiers, right? Which are your most business critical applications? Do you have those taken care of? So when you have an outage, the impact to your stakeholders is as minimal as possible. And it's about choosing the right solution that optimizes your recovery investments. Right? For your tier 0, it might be a completely different set of investment, different cost proposition than your tier 2 or 3 systems. The other piece to think about is it's not just about that at time of disaster, or in many cases, the time of test experience. We tend to, as an industry, focus purely on that, right? It's all about how do I make sure that my tests are optimized, and I'll do a bunch of prep work before my test, pass the test, and everything is good. But the reality is you're not protected, because in that situation, if a disaster struck, are you ready, right? It's all about recovery readiness. And you don't have the time to prepare and do the unnatural things that you do in advance of a test. So to have a successful recovery program, there's a number of elements that you need to think about. Number one is back to the point of understanding those application tiers and the criticality of those tiers. You also need to be able to understand what are the dependencies, how do your applications map to your IT systems, and what are the dependencies of those systems. I remember talking to a customer once, and they were basically leveraging our facilities to do recovery themselves. And at the end of the recovery, they basically said, yeah, we were successful. We got 99% of our systems up. But there was one problem, right? Our AD system wasn't recovered properly. So in terms of the number of systems, it's only one system that failed, but it is the most important system because none of their users could log onto the systems. The stakeholders couldn't use their systems, right? And that's as good as not recovering at all. So being able to understand your dependencies, being able to understand how those dependencies impact those business applications, and making sure you've got your plans in place for the different tiers of applications is critical. So especially for larger enterprises, to try to do this manually is extremely hard. You need to make sure you've got automated mechanisms, automated tools out there. Application discovery, dependency mapping tools have been around for a while, but it takes skill and experience to be able to learn to use those as well. But those tools are available for you. The other piece is making sure you're designing the right recovery approach, right? So it's one thing to say, I understand, here's all my application tiers, here's my business impact, I understand that fully. I even understand how it maps to my IT systems and the dependencies underneath that. Now I've got to make sure I've got the right recovery architectures in place, the right plans in place, right? The right procedures. And I've got to build that and make sure I've got the experience to put that in place. The third piece is a time of test or a time of disaster. Do I have the expertise to be able to run successfully, right? Building systems, restoring networks on the fly. With newer DRAS systems, obviously there's a lot of automation in place, but it's not just about bringing up your virtual machines. It's about all those things that you have to do after you bring up your VMs so that your applications can start up and can run effectively. And the last but not least piece here is it's fine doing that in advance of a test, but what happens between your last test and your current disaster? Have you updated your recovery designs? Have you updated your procedures? Have you kept up with the production change? Right. So the change management, lifecycle management is a critical element to being successful as well. So for you to recover successfully, and this applies whether it's a natural disaster or a cyber disaster, you've got to make sure that you have these competencies in place. Understanding your production, the road to successful recovery starts with a well understood map of your production environment. Unless you understand your production well, unless you understand the dependencies, map them to your business criticality tiers, you're not going to have an effective recovery strategy. You've got to make sure you have the right designs in place, you have the right ability to recover, and you keep everything in sync with those changes in production. Last but not least is don't forget about your people as well, right? So in the event of a disaster, we often think about bringing up our systems, applications are up, and our stakeholders can access the systems. But where are those stakeholders, right? If a disaster takes out your offices, are they able to access your system? Do you need to have access to workplace facilities where they can go and operate out of those facilities for a period of time? Now, certain industries, obviously financial services industries, regulated industries, the cost of that downtime is really significant, right? And especially, for example, think about a trader desk, right? You've got to have those traders back up in operation as quickly as possible so you can meet those regulatory requirements at the end of the day. And that's why it's important to think about these things, right? Whether it's spare office capacity that you have, or whether you're contracting with a third-party vendor for access to facilities at time of disaster, you've got to make sure that you think about that as well. Sometimes it's not about days, it could be about months. And like I said earlier, we went through this experience where we were out of our office for several weeks once Hurricane Harvey happened, and there were other companies in the same area that were out for months. So this is actually real and something that you need to think about. So in conclusion, as we draw to a close here, hopefully what you've been able to learn is that cyber resilience is something that's important. It's here to stay. This is the 21st century disaster. And you've got to think about not just cyber attacks, but also traditional disasters as well. Those are not going away. What that means is you've got to adapt your recovery plans, your procedures, your data protection plans to these latest cyber threats, and make sure that you're protected and you're thinking about all these things. You've also got to make sure that you're using both proactive and reactive security controls. Right? So clearly there's a lot of investment and focus in security, making sure you've got the defense in depth with all the different types of security tools in place, but also remembering that it's not a case of when, it's not a case of if, it's a case of when you're impacted, right? Making sure your security and DR teams are collaborating, not when you have a disaster in the heat of the crisis, but well in advance, right? Make sure those teams are working together. They may have conflicting goals. How are they going to resolve them? What are the procedures? What are the steps in place that need to be taken when you are actually impacted? And then from a recovery standpoint, we've covered how the world has changed, right? Instead of thinking about physical separation, my data center is 50 miles away or 100 miles away, that's no longer enough. If you're on the same network, then malware has been propagated regardless of how far the network, that second data center is from your primary one. So it's about logical separation and dealing with both physical and logical separation to deal with natural attacks as well as cyber attacks. It's about thinking of your data protection from a different perspective. It's not just about the most recent copy of data, but giving yourself the ability, the options to go back to multiple copies of data as well. And it's also making sure that you've got access to isolated environments. If you need to recover, how do you make sure that you go there, you've got access to those environments, you're able to recover your applications in that isolated environment from clean data? And especially with ransomware, there's just so many variants and there's so many different types of impacts from those ransomware attacks. If someone comes to you and tells you they've got the silver bullet and you just need to buy this gizmo, buy this solution that takes care of everything and solves your ransomware attack readiness, then you need to think about that, because that's probably not true, right? It's not a single solution, not a single silver bullet that can solve all those problems. It's about making sure that you've got the right technologies in place, you've got the right organizational structure in place, you've got the right plans in place, and then you've got the right mentality at time of disaster that you're able to evolve and adapt and be able to take care of these risks. So I started this session with some pictures describing a personal situation, right, where we were nearly impacted by Hurricane Harvey, right? Thankfully, again, like I said, that the floodwaters did not enter our homes. It impacted a lot of other people around us. And what's interesting is last month, my parents live in India, in a state called Kerala. Some of you may have heard of it. Most of you probably don't even know where Kerala is, right? If you Google Kerala, what you'll see is it's a beautiful state, and that's a completely unbiased opinion from me, right? It's a beautiful state, very, very pristine, lots of green, lots of waters, tourist destination for many people. And Kerala was impacted by some floods, some significant floods that were worse than Hurricane Harvey. And I remember talking to my dad, and our house is basically on the bank of a river, but we're really high up. And my dad has always said for 300 years, his ancestors have never been flooded in that location, which is why they built the house up there. Now, what is interesting is during these floods, as I talked to him, even though I had faced waters outside my house, I never, for even a single moment, thought that they were impacted or they would be impacted. Because over years, the floodwaters have risen. They've never come to the house. They've gone away. But unfortunately, for the first time this year, it actually entered the house and they got flooded. Now, the impact wasn't too bad. Thankfully, they're back in the house. It took some time and effort, but the state was pretty badly impacted. And I share that story because what's interesting to me is I've been talking about disaster recovery and the importance of not underestimating the impact of disasters. And I had sat here, looked outside my window and seen the water rising. But even there, when I talked to my dad, I never thought that they would be impacted because, we felt 300 years, nothing's happened. Why is it going to happen to us now? But it did. And that's the key point that I want to leave you with, right? If there's one message, it's basically don't underestimate the impact of disasters. Be prepared for it. If you're thinking about planning for the disaster when it hits, it's too late. You've got to do that well in advance. And the last thought that I've got is you need to maintain a healthy level of paranoia. But if you take the approach that it's not going to happen to me, then what happens is when you're impacted, you're not ready for it. Right now, I'm not saying that we need to go and go to the extreme here, but it's the key thing is making sure that you've got a healthy level of paranoia so you're well prepared. So I hope that was useful. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll hand it back to Bob to see if you have any questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Joseph. Great information shared. And again, if you do have any questions for Joseph, you can locate the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If we do not get to your questions here today, there are several that already been submitted. We will have access to the questions. We'll follow up with everyone after the webinar's ended. So first question here today, are you seeing your customers take cyber resilience more seriously and make changes in their DR plans and strategy accordingly?
Yeah, that is a good question, right? And what's interesting, Bob, is that we tend to think about disasters when they happen, and we tend to forget fully the sort of this recency effect. As soon as a disaster happens, there's usually an increased focus, there's increased attention, and then once it sort of fades away into your rear view mirror, you tend to go back to your normal practices, right? So that's something that we see. But what's happened is clearly with these cyber attacks, there is increased focus on this, right? We are seeing, even in our customer base, we're seeing increased disaster declarations caused by cyber attacks. And even if you look at some of the analyst reports, traditionally DR spend has been in the range of 3% of your total IT spend. That's always what it's been for many years, right? And we're seeing that increase, right? We're seeing people look at this seriously and saying, I got to take care of this. I don't want to see my name in the papers, right? If I'm a CIO or I run an IT organization, these threats are real. I would say that there's progress, but there's still more that needs to be done, right? I think people tend to forget, and what's important is making sure that you have that healthy sense of paranoia and that you're putting the right investments in place. And at the end of the day, that you understand the risks and you're comfortable with the level of risk that you can take, right? If you understand that, you're comfortable, you've got the right mechanisms in place, then great, that's where you need to be.
All right, next question here. You stated that security and DR teams often have conflicting goals. Can you give an example of these?
Yeah, I mean, so one example was, where I was talking about the focus of the teams, right? So from a security system perspective, they're looking at identifying what caused this, right? There's almost this forensics mindset to say, what caused this? How do I preserve data? How do I keep things just the way they are, right? And make sure that I can solve the problem and identify where they are, right? So that I know how not to prevent this in the future. The DR team, on the other hand, is all about, I don't care what caused it, right? That's for a different day. I want to make sure I can bring my business back up and running as quickly as possible, right? So as you get to policies and what do you want to do and how do you handle those situations, it's a different mindset, right, in many ways, and rightly so, right? And what you need to do is bring both together, because it's not one or the other. You need to be able to understand what caused it. How do you make sure you're taking care of, your regulatory reporting requirements if you're impacted by a breach or a cyber attack? But it's also about bringing your business back up and running as quickly as possible, which is why these teams need to collaborate. They need to decide upfront, right? How often do they keep a system in place? How often do they wait before they declare a disaster? When do they try to solve a problem in their production systems versus when do they actually try to fail over to another recovery system? Those are the types of things that you need to take care of.
All right, wonderful. Next question here. Do you need both data backup and replication systems to protect against the range of natural and cyber disasters?
That is a good question, right? So the answer is yes, absolutely, right? So backup, you need backup for a variety of use cases, right? You need backup for operational reasons, right? If you lose a file, you delete something by mistake, you've got to be able to back up and recover it. You've got regulatory compliance reasons that drive backup. Like I discussed earlier, a lot of the trend in the industry has been towards how do you make sure you've got replicated most recent snapshot of data. But as you think about the threats and dealing with both natural attacks as well as cyber attacks, you want to be able to recover as quickly as possible, right? That's not changing. If you have an attack, I need to be able to recover as quickly as possible. I need to have replicated copies of my data. But you've also got to think about that worst case scenario where you've got to go back to a copy of data 3 weeks ago, right, before you're impacted by a ransomware attack. And you're typically not going to keep that in your replicated systems. So that's where you also need your backup systems. And what you need to think about is, do you need to do that for all your systems, or is this something that you define for your most critical systems? And then your tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 systems, do you take a different level of risk? It's all about risk management and making sure you've got the right protection in place, depending on the business impact, the impact of data loss and downtime, right? That's what you got to think about. And if it's important to you and you can't afford that, you better have both systems in place.
All right, how can the public cloud help customers with backup and recovery? What about customers that adopt public cloud for production applications?
Yeah, public cloud is obviously here to stay, right? We see the growth of platforms like AWS and Azure, right? And what we see is, especially in terms of disaster recovery adoption, we're starting to see a lot more interest in that. Because at the end of the day, from a DR perspective, you want to make sure that you've got the ability to recover, but you also don't want to keep a system up and running or pay for a system that you may or may not use, right? You want to deal with a usage-based model where you're paying for resources at time of test or disaster. That's the ideal sort of scenario. And public cloud gives you that option as well, right? So now you've got the ability to recover or back up data to the public cloud if that's your disaster recovery solution. It also gives you a way to test your readiness for public cloud adoption, right? Instead of moving your production applications right away, you might decide to test it out for your DR posture and making sure you're ready in the event of a disaster. Sungard AS, obviously, we've invested a lot in terms of delivering recovery in our facilities, but also embracing the public cloud, embracing AWS specifically, right, to be able to deliver those services to customers as well. If your customers are adopting public cloud and moving your production there, think about it as you may think that your disaster recovery problems are all taken care of, right, by the public cloud provider. But if that's your belief, then you got to think again, right? So obviously, public cloud infrastructure is much more resilient than a lot of you can build internally. But the reality is they focused on infrastructure resiliency, right? In terms of your application, in terms of your backup needs, what happens if you've got application issues, right? You've got data that gets deleted because you've got a bug in your system, right? It doesn't matter if AWS or Azure has maintained 99.5 nines or 8 nines of availability. If you've got data that's deleted, you're still responsible for it, right? So you're thinking about backup and you're thinking about recovery when you go to the public cloud. If you think that those problems have been outsourced, then think again, right? That's something that's important as well.
All right, this is a more of opinion question. Is the tendency of the business continuity profession moving to information security departments true?
That's an interesting question, right? So the answer is it depends, right? It varies by organization, and I have not seen that as a trend per se. You can see that business continuity, there's cases where it's under the business, there's companies where it's still part of IT, there's companies where it's under security and risk, right? So you're seeing that vary. I don't know, and I've not seen an evolution where you can call that a trend. It depends on the type of organization, depends on the size of the organization. What's critical, though, is wherever it lives in the organization, that's probably less important than the fact that these organizations need to all work together, right? So at the end of the day, it's the confluence of security, understanding your risk, understanding business continuity and your posture there, your IT disaster recovery readiness. These teams need to work together so that you've got organizational resiliency and are able to address these types of threats.
All right. How important is having an accurate inventory of IT assets within the company?
I think that's absolutely critical, right? So if you don't know what you have and you can't map it, then how can you recover your systems? And it amazes me. I've over the years, my background is systems management before I came to Sungard AS, and it never ceases to amaze me when I talk to customers, large enterprise customers, and I ask them, how many business applications do you have, and do you have a good mapping of those applications to your IT systems, right? Have you kept that up to date? And I get these blank stares, or I get questions where people admit that, yeah, they might have done it a couple of years ago, or they might have a high level understanding, but they don't know the specifics. And if you don't, then how are you going to be able to recover those systems, right? So especially where you've got multiple systems, you've got dependencies, how do you make sure you track that? How do you make sure that you keep that up to date? That is critical. And the landscape is changing, right? It's no longer about applications that reside within your IT environment. In many cases, you're already using public cloud, you're using SaaS applications. Those dependencies are starting to cross organizational boundaries as well. And unless you know and understand those dependencies, unless you understand how to manage them, how are you going to be able to recover successfully, right? And because of the complexity, trying to do that manually and trying to do that with scripts is almost impossible, right? So we in fact discovered that the hard way, in a sense, right? When we launched our managed recovery services many years ago, we tried to do it that way, and we realized that couldn't work, that didn't scale. So we invested in essentially automated discovery dependency mapping mechanisms, mapping customer configurations in a CMDB, and being able to track and manage that. We think that's essential. That's the only way that you can guarantee a recovery outcome.
All right, wonderful. We'll take one more question, and again, if we do not get to your question here today, we will follow up with everyone after the webinar's ended. So don't worry if we don't get to your question. So final question here: how effective is automated discovery and dependency mapping? Isn't there application knowledge that cannot be automatically detected by a tool?
Now, that's a really good point, right? If somebody tells you there's a tool that fixes everything for you, then either walk away from them, or if it is true, then let me know as quickly as possible, right? Because there is no tool that solves everything, right? Tools obviously make things a lot better, right? They can automate a lot of manual steps. And what we've discovered is it's a combination. There's an art and science to it, right? There's obviously the science and the automation, the tools, but there's the art, right? There's knowledge that's in people's heads. What we've discovered is if you have the tools out there that discover the environment, right, that map what standard applications are, right, that basically give you a topology view of your applications, and you put that in front of the application owners, and you start drawing boundaries in front and defining these application boundaries, you can start capturing the knowledge in their heads, right? That knowledge is not something that any tool can find. But the fact that you can facilitate that, the fact that you have a mechanism to be able to do that, helps you much quicker and much more efficiently identify those application boundaries and dependencies. So it's a combination of experience and skills and tools. That's what you got to have in place to be able to do that successfully.
All right, wonderful. Well, that wraps up the Q&A section here of our webinar today. Excellent Q&A session, Joseph. So any parting words here today?
No, thank you very much. And, if you have any questions, let me know. But key point here is don't underestimate the disaster. And my thoughts and prayers obviously are with the folks impacted by Hurricane Michael at this time. I think we're going to see a lot more disasters going forward, but let's make sure that at the end of this session, if you're better prepared, then I've done my work here.
All right, wonderful. Thanks again, everyone, for their attendance here today. We again hope we gathered some great information from today's webinar. DRJ would also like to thank Joseph for his time here today, as well as Sungard Availability Services for sponsoring today's webinar. Sungard will be emailing everyone a link to the recording, as well as the slide deck from today's webinar. You may view the webinar as frequently as you wish, or share it with your peers. If you do have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal. Thank you again, and this now ends today's webinar.